weeks' time, I think. I think it's the best record we've ever made, which I don't always believe when you finish. By the time the records come out, I normally find fault with them already.
It happened without warning. The kind of unexpected jolt that ripples through both the music industry and the fan communities that orbit it. At a panel hosted in London during a retrospective event on the intersection of punk and pop influences in late 20th century music, Elvis Costello, never one to shy away from sharp observations, made a statement that felt like a sudden bolt of lightning. Sitting comfortably on stage beside other luminaries, he leaned into the microphone, and with the kind of calm clarity that gives a statement more power than any shout, brought up a name most in the room hadn't expected to hear that day: Agnetha Faltskog. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Costello, known for his barbed wit and deep intellect when it comes to music history, was discussing the way pop culture has historically buried or misrepresented certain narratives. With little preamble, he pointed to what he described as a manufactured innocence that surrounded certain artists in the 1970s and 80s, particularly those that operated within carefully curated European pop machines. Then, with his words cutting through the collective breath of the room, he said something few could have anticipated. Agnetha Faltskog, best known as one-fourth of ABBA, had been, according to him, at the heart of a controlled myth, one that masked more than it revealed. The audience, a mixture of journalists, music historians, and longtime fans, stiffened. The implications were immediate. For decades, Agnetha had been enshrined as the shy blonde of ABBA, the reluctant star, the reserved Swede with the angelic voice. That image, perpetuated both by media and the group's management, had become part of pop music lore. Costello's suggestion wasn't just a casual musing, it was a direct challenge to the entire narrative structure surrounding one of pop's most iconic acts. He didn't elaborate with malice. There was no cruelty in his tone, no resentment. Instead, he dissected with precision, almost like a surgeon revealing something hidden beneath the surface of a familiar body. Costello framed his remarks as a broader commentary on how image and persona were wielded by producers and marketing teams, not just in the case of ABBA, but across the landscape of 70s and 80s music. Still, the specificity of his comments about Agnetha carried weight. He claimed that behind the facade of her quiet demeanor was a sharper, more driven mind. Someone who had, according to him, exercised far more creative control than the public had ever been led to believe. This, he argued, wasn't simply a case of misunderstanding. It was intentional obscuration. The idea that Agnetha might not have been merely the emotive voice shaped by others, but a calculated force in the studio, upends decades of assumptions. Costello alluded to songwriting sessions where she pushed back against arrangements and offered alternative melodic structures. He referenced accounts, largely hidden or downplayed, of her refusing vocal takes until they met her standards. It was a suggestion that she had been instrumental not just in performance, but in shaping the DNA of the songs themselves. It was this quiet authority, this allegedly uncredited influence, that Costello claimed had been scrubbed from most accounts of the group's dynamic. As he spoke, the tension in the room thickened. No one interrupted. There was a gravity to his words, a deliberate clarity that made it impossible to dismiss them as offhand commentary. He wasn't issuing gossip. He was, in his own way, redefining the architecture of one of music's most enduring legacies. Costello didn't provide proof in the conventional sense. There were no documents, no recordings played. But his tone suggested a familiarity with the behind-the-scenes workings that lent credibility to his claims. The implications of Costello's remarks reverberated almost immediately. If Agnetha had indeed been more of a creative architect than previously understood, then the traditional narrative of ABBA as being chiefly driven by Benny Andersson and Bjorn Ulvaeus would require a serious reassessment. The idea that her role had been minimized, whether through industry mechanisms or public assumption, raises larger questions about the erasure of women's contributions in pop music history, especially those who didn't fit the mold of the outspoken diva or the headline-grabbing iconoclast. Costello seemed to be hinting at a systemic pattern rather than an isolated case. Agnetha, in his framing, wasn't just a victim of image control. She was emblematic of an era where control over one's art was often siphoned off from those deemed least likely to challenge the narrative, especially women who, intentionally or not, allowed the public to perceive them as passive. The event quickly turned into a flashpoint. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Journalists scribbled furiously. There was no immediate response from those on stage with him. Some seemed caught off guard, others perhaps unsure whether to weigh in on such a sensitive and seismic claim. Yet Costello did not waver. He continued, drawing lines between Agnetha's alleged creative authority and the larger themes of misattribution that haunted pop's golden eras. He referenced instances where she had been subtly repositioned in interviews, where her thoughts on music were sidelined in favor of questions about her beauty or personal life. Costello even pointed to interview tapes, unreleased according to him, where Agnetha spoke eloquently about melodic theory and vocal layering, only to have those segments edited out before broadcast. These weren't errors of omission, he argued. They were deliberate choices by media outlets and publicists who had a vested interest in preserving a marketable narrative. What makes this moment so significant is not simply what Costello said, but the manner in which he said it. With no bluster, no scandal-mongering, he elevated the conversation into one about legacy, perception, and justice. It wasn't an exposé in the tabloid sense. It was a recalibration, a pulling back of the curtain. For a figure like Costello, whose career has always walked the line between punk's bite and intellectual critique, this kind of surgical commentary wasn't entirely out of character. But even for him, this was bold. And it raises deep questions about how much we really know about our idols. How many artists like Agnetha have had their contributions diluted or reshaped into more palatable stories? How often do we participate in that process as fans and consumers, reinforcing the myths that are easiest to digest? Costello's revelation wasn't about Agnetha alone. It was about the machinery that builds personas, the invisible hands that mold public perception with careful, often unseen force. In the days that followed, though discussion of the remarks was inevitable, it was the moment itself that lingered. That room, those words, the breathless pause after he said her name, it all hung suspended in the collective memory of those present. What had been a retrospective event turned into a live dissection of truth versus image, and few would forget the sharpness with which Costello had cut through years of accumulated assumption. There's something undeniably magnetic about the notion of Agnetha not as a passive vessel for others' creativity, but as an orchestrator in her own right. A hidden architect who, for reasons perhaps personal, professional, or institutional, was never fully credited. Costello didn't accuse her of deception. On the contrary, he seemed to admire her restraint, her ability to operate within and against a system that preferred her silent and luminous, not assertive and analytical. This reframing holds power. If true, it doesn't diminish ABBA's legacy. It enriches it. It adds depth to their narrative, introducing complexity where before there had only been simplicity. Agnetha's haunting performances, her emotive crescendos, her breathy melancholy, all might be seen not just as results of gifted singing, but as deliberate choices, shaped by someone with a keen sense of tone, timing, and nuance. Costello's words won't rewrite history overnight, but they force a reconsideration, a re-listening, an opening of the mind to what might have been lurking beneath decades of glossy retrospectives. For every person who saw Agnetha as the quiet one, the reluctant star who stepped back from fame for personal peace, there is now a counter-image, that of the strategic, perhaps even quietly defiant artist who played a long game within a system that rarely afforded her full credit. What Elvis Costello did wasn't just speak out of turn. He destabilized a myth. He introduced friction into a polished story, and in doing so, he invited a deeper, more rewarding engagement with the music and the minds behind it. Whether fans embrace this reinterpretation or resist it, the impact is undeniable. A veil has been lifted. The portrait of Agnetha Faltskog is no longer just that of the fragile pop angel. It may also be that of a silent powerhouse, an artist whose true story has only just begun to surface. The ripple from Costello's revelation traveled far beyond the panel. In studios and lecture halls, conversations ignited not just about Agnetha's hidden influence, but about the broader dynamics of visibility and erasure in collaborative music. Scholars began re-examining production credits with fresh scrutiny, while fans revisited old tracks, listening not just for what was sung, but for what might have been shaped behind the scenes. The silence that had long surrounded certain contributions now seemed intentional, even strategic. Costello hadn't merely exposed a person, he'd cracked open a system, urging the world to rethink how legacy is truly constructed. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Elvis Costello exposing Agnetha Faltskog's secrets? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.